Welcome, my friends, to Wild Cowboy Tales. This is where the dust of the trails meets the fire of the heart, where legends are forged with gunpowder and courage. If you love stories of the Wild West, of lone riders and the high price of justice, I invite you to hit the subscribe button. It won't cost you a penny, but it helps keep these stories alive, stoking the campfire for all who wander across this digital frontier. Now, settle in. Night is falling, and the violins are being tuned. This is the perfect moment for a story. A story about a woman who invited her enemies to a dance and turned the dance floor into a deadly hunt. For 6 months, the Crimson River Ranch had been a place of silence. The laughter that once echoed from the sprawling main house was gone, replaced by a grief so profound it seemed to have seeped into the very soil. Jacob Vance, the ranch's heart and master, was dead. The official story, signed off by the sheriff in the nearby town of Redemption, was a tragic accident: a stampede during a cattle drive, a horse that fell, a life crushed beneath a torrent of panicked hooves. His widow, Alara Vance, had become a ghost in her own home. The town saw her only on Sundays, a slender figure in black, her face obscured by a heavy veil, her shoulders bowed under the weight of her loss. They spoke of her in hushed, pitying tones. "Poor woman," they'd say. "To lose a man like Jacob so young. The ranch will be too much for her. She'll have to sell." And so, when the invitations arrived, they were met with a stunned disbelief that quickly turned into murmurs of approval. They were printed on fine, cream-colored cardstock, the script elegant and clear. Alara Vance requested the honor of their presence at a memorial dance, to be held in the ranch's grand barn 1 month hence. It was to be a celebration of Jacob's life, a night to replace the silence with music and laughter, to honor his memory by embracing the community he had loved so dearly. In the dusty, smoke-filled office of the Redemption Sheriff, Sheriff Brody looked at the invitation and chuckled, tossing it onto his cluttered desk. "Well, he said to his deputy. "The little widow's finally coming out of her shell. Guess she's ready to find a new man to manage that land." He saw a party, a chance for free whiskey, and a woman who was no longer a problem. Miles away, on the sprawling plains of the Circle T Ranch, Marcus Thorne read the same invitation. Thorne was a rival rancher whose land bordered the Crimson River. He and Jacob had been locked in a bitter dispute over water rights for years. He saw Lara's invitation as a white flag. The grieving, helpless woman was surely preparing to sell, and this dance was her way of showing the community she was ready to move on. He saw opportunity, the final, easy acquisition of the land he had coveted for a decade. And in the main bunkhouse of the Crimson River Ranch itself, the foreman, Dutch Hogan, held the invitation in his thick, scarred hands. Hogan was a bull of a man, retained by Alara to manage the ranch after Jacob's death. He had been Jacob's right-hand man for years. He read the card and a cruel, knowing smirk touched his lips. He saw a foolish woman, lost in sentiment, trying to cling to a past that was gone. He saw a party that would solidify his own control over the ranch hands and the land. He saw weakness. They all saw what they wanted to see. They saw a grieving widow, a lonely woman, a soft target. None of them saw the woman who had stood over her husband's suspiciously mangled body, her heart not just breaking, but hardening into something cold, sharp, and patient. None of them had seen her in the weeks after the funeral, not weeping, but meticulously cleaning Jacob's cold peacemaker, her movements precise, her eyes dry and burning with a light that was anything but grief. On the evening she sent the invitations, Alara stood in the vast, cathedral-like barn. Dozens of lanterns, polished and filled, hung from the high rafters, unlit. The floor had been swept clean of hay and dust. It was a space waiting for music, for laughter, for life. But for Alara, it was a stage, a killing ground. She walked the perimeter of the great room, her hand trailing along the rough-hewn wooden walls. Her mind was not filled with memories of dances with Jacob. It was a cold, clear map of sight lines, of shadows, of exits and entrances. She noted the heavy block and tackle hanging in the hayloft, the deep, shadowed stalls of the tack room, the sturdy oaken door of Jacob's old office at the back. Every feature of the barn was a potential weapon, a component of the intricate, deadly machine she had been designing in her mind for 6 months. She stopped in the center of the floor and pulled a small, worn leather-bound book from her pocket. It was Jacob's journal. In the last few weeks of his life, his entries had been troubled, filled with notes about betrayal. Brody is on Thorne's payroll. I have the proof. Dutch is moving my cattle at night. I think he's working with Thorne. They are planning something. I have to be careful. The stampede had been no accident. It had been an execution. And the men who had planned it, the men who had profited from it, had all accepted her invitation. You wanted a celebration, my love, she whispered into the echoing silence of the barn, her voice a low, chilling promise. And I will give them one. A night so memorable, not a single one of them will live to see the dawn. She looked at her hands. They had once been soft, made for holding her husband, for planting a garden. Now, they were steady, capable, and ready to hold a gun. The grieving widow the town saw was a carefully crafted costume. Tonight, she was putting the finishing touches on the stage. Soon, the actors would arrive for their final performance. The rancher's widow was hosting a dance, and the price of admission was a man's life. The month leading up to the dance was a masterclass in deception. To the outside world, Alara Vance was a woman consumed by preparations for a grand social event. She rode into Redemption twice a week, a list in her hand, placing orders with the dry goods store for bolts of colorful ribbon and crates of candles. She hired the best fiddle player from 3 counties over, promising him a handsome bonus. She even consulted with Marcus Thorne about the best way to procure enough whiskey for 200 guests. An act of such perceived humility and neighborliness that it completely extinguished any suspicion he might have had. But her true work was done at night, in the solitude of the Crimson River Ranch. After the ranch hands, led by the swaggering Dutch Hogan, had retired to the bunkhouse, Laura would slip out of the main house and head to the barn. Her workshop was Jacob's old office, the one room she kept permanently locked. Inside, the room was not that of a grieving widow, but of a quartermaster preparing for war. On the large oak desk, where Jacob had once planned cattle drives, lay a detailed schematic of the barn. It was marked with dozens of small, coded symbols. A red X marked a loose floorboard over a shallow pit in the tack room. A blue circle in the hayloft indicated a rope, expertly tied into a slip noose, coiled and hidden beneath a pile of hay, its other end looped over a beam and tied off in the shadows. Her first task had been to understand the men. For 6 months, she had studied them from afar. She knew Sheriff Brody was a drunk and a cheat at cards, his greed surpassed only by his cowardice. She knew Marcus Thorne was an arrogant peacock, obsessed with his own reflection and the sound of his own voice, a man who could be easily flattered and led. And she knew Dutch Hogan was a creature of pure, brutish ego, a man who responded to any perceived challenge with his fists and who held a deep, misogynistic contempt for her, seeing her as nothing more than a prize that came with the ranch. Her second task was preparing her tools. Jacob had been a meticulous man. He had taught her to shoot, not for sport, but for survival. Out here, Alara, he'd said, a steady hand is as important as a strong fence. And a locked chest beneath their bed, she found his arsenal. The Colt Peacemaker, its action smooth as silk. A Winchester rifle, its wood stock horn smooth by his hands. And a small, elegant Remington Derringer, a 2-shot weapon of last resort he had called his ace in the hole. Night after night, she practiced in a secluded arroyo far from the house. She wasn't just shooting at tins. She was practicing the movements she would need. Drawing the Derringer from a hidden holster strapped to her thigh, firing the Colt from behind cover, reloading in the dark, her fingers knowing the mechanism by feel alone. She was not a natural killer, but she was a methodical student. Her grief was the cold, hard discipline that drove her. Her final and most important task was setting the stage. The trap was not one grand, explosive event. It was a series of smaller, interlocking snares, each tailored to a specific target. For Sheriff Brody, a known whiskey aficionado, she had procured a special, private bottle of aged bourbon. She had carefully drilled a tiny hole in the bottom of the bottle, injected a potent, fast-acting sedative she had learned to distill from the local weed that grew in the hills, and then sealed the hole with colored wax. The bottle would sit on the desk in Jacob's office, an irresistible temptation for a man she planned to lure into a private chat. For Marcus Thorne, the vain land baron, the trap was social. She knew he would want to be seen as the most important man at the dance. She would feed his ego, ask for his advice on a private matter concerning the ranch's future, and suggest they speak somewhere quieter, away from the noise of the crowd, somewhere like the hayloft, which offered a commanding view of the festivities. For Dutch Hogan, the trap was a challenge to his authority. She had identified two ranch hands who had been closest to Dutch, the ones most likely involved in Jacob's murder. She would create a situation, a faked argument, a supposed theft that would require Dutch to assert his control, to drag the accused man outside for some bunkhouse justice. She would be waiting for him in the shadows of the corral. The brilliance of her plan was in its camouflage. The music of the fiddles would cover the sounds of a struggle. The press of the dancing crowd would hide the absence of one or two men. The flowing whiskey would blur memories and dull suspicions. She was using the very fabric of a celebration as a weapon. Each laughing guest, each dancing couple, was an unwitting accomplice, a piece of living camouflage for her deadly work. On the afternoon of the dance, she stood before the long mirror in her bedroom. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk, a color of mourning, but also of blood and vengeance. It was elegant, respectable, the perfect costume. Strapped to her thigh, hidden beneath the layers of silk, was the cold, hard reality of the derringer. She looked at her own reflection. The face staring back was calm, her eyes clear. The grieving widow was gone. In her place was executioner, ready to host a party. The web was spun, every strand in place. All that was left was for the flies to arrive. The lanterns cast a warm, golden glow, transforming the cavernous barn into a ballroom of impossible rustic beauty. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, perfume, and roasted pig. On a raised platform, the fiddler drew his bow, and a lively tune spilled out, setting toes tapping and hands clapping. The Crimson River Ranch, a place of silence for so long, was alive with music and laughter. Alara Vance stood at the entrance, a vision in crimson, playing the part of the gracious hostess to perfection. She welcomed each guest with a warm, steady hand and a serene smile that never quite reached her eyes. The townspeople, seeing her strength, her poise, felt a wave of admiration. They saw a woman rising from the ashes, a testament to the resilience of the frontier spirit. Then her targets began to arrive. Sheriff Brody swaggered in, his belly straining the buttons of his best coat, his face already flushed. "A fine party, Mrs. Vance," he boomed, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long. "A fine tribute to a fine man." "Thank you for coming, Sheriff," Alara said, her smile unwavering. "Jacob always valued your friendship. Please, help yourself to the whiskey. I have a feeling it will be a long and memorable night." Her eyes guided him toward the bar, where the common stock flowed freely. The special bottle waited patiently in the office. Marcus Thorne arrived like a king holding court, flanked by two of his foremen. He was dressed in an expensive Eastern suit, a diamond stickpin glittering in his cravat. He took Alara's hand and bowed low, a parody of a gentleman. "Alara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as old leather. "To see you looking so radiant is a balm to the soul. This is a magnificent gesture. You honor us all." "The honor is all mine, Marcus," she replied, gently retrieving her hand. "I do hope we'll have a chance to speak later. There are matters of business, of the future, where I would be so grateful for your counsel." A predatory gleam entered Thorne's eyes. "Of course, my dear," he purred. "Anything for Jacob's widow." Finally, Dutch Hogan appeared. He did not enter so much as fill the doorway. He had slicked his hair back, but he couldn't disguise the brutish set of his jaw or the coldness in his eyes. He surveyed the scene with the air of a man who owned it. "Evening, ma'am," he grunted, his gaze sweeping over her dress with an insolent appraisal. "You clean up nice." "I'm so glad you could make it, Dutch," Alara said, her voice even. "The ranch wouldn't be running without you. Please, enjoy yourself. You've earned it." He smirked, satisfied with what he perceived as her deference, and pushed his way toward the whiskey. The trap was now set. The principal actors were on the stage. For the first hour, Alara moved through the crowd, a phantom of grace. She danced with the mayor, shared a quiet word with the wives of neighboring ranchers, and ensured every guest's cup was full. She was a whirlwind of perfect social grace, her movements fluid, her smile a constant, reassuring presence. But beneath the silk and smiles, she was a predator on the prowl, watching, waiting, her senses honed to a razor's edge. She watched Sheriff Brody down 3 glasses of cheap whiskey in quick succession, his laughter growing louder, his movements more clumsy. She watched Marcus Thorne holding court near the fireplace, pontificating to a circle of mesmerized lesser ranchers. And she watched Dutch Hogan, who was not dancing, but leaning against a support beam, his eyes scanning the crowd, a hawk looking for prey. With him were the two ranch hands she had marked, a lanky, nervous man named Pike and a surly, quiet one called Boone. The time was approaching. The fiddler struck up a fast, riotous reel, and the dancing became more frantic, the stomping of boots on the wooden floor a perfect, rhythmic cover for any other sound. Alara saw her opening. She caught Pike's eye and gave him a small, subtle nod, a prearranged signal. He was her unwilling accomplice, a man she had cornered days before, using evidence from Jacob's journal of his minor role in the conspiracy to secure his cooperation. His life in exchange for his help tonight. Pike, his face pale with sweat, stumbled as if drunk and collided with Boone, spilling a full mug of beer down the front of the bigger man's shirt. Boone snarled, shoving Pike hard. "Watch where you're going, you clumsy oaf." The confrontation was exactly what Dutch Hogan was waiting for. It was a chance to demonstrate his power. He strode over, grabbing both men by their collars. "Not in here," he growled. "You want to settle this? You do it outside." He began to drag the two men toward the side door that led to the dark corrals. This was the first move of the deadly chess game. As Dutch disappeared out the door, Alara turned her attention to her second target. She approached Sheriff Brody, who was now leaning heavily on the bar. "Sheriff," she said, her voice soft and concerned. "You look a little warm. Perhaps a quieter place to sit for a moment. I have a bottle of Jacob's private stock of fine Kentucky bourbon in his office. I'd be honored if you would share a glass with me, for Jacob's memory." Brody's eyes lit up with alcoholic greed. The chance to drink his dead friend's best whiskey, alone with his beautiful widow, was an offer he couldn't refuse. "An honor, Mrs. Vance," he slurred, allowing her to guide his unsteady steps toward the back of the barn. "A true honor." As the fiddler played on and the dancers spun, oblivious, the widow of the ranch led the town's chief lawman into the darkness. The music was a joyful, thumping heartbeat, counting down the final moments of a trader's life. The hunt had begun. The corrals behind the barn were a labyrinth of shadow and moonlight. The sounds of the part-tied lively fiddle, the rhythmic stomping, the laughter were a distant, festive counterpoint to the grim business at hand. Dutch Hogan slammed Pike against a fence post, his thick forearm pressing against the man's throat. "You're gettin' sloppy, Pike," Dutch snarled, his voice a low growl. "Spillin' drinks, mackin' a scene. Thorne won't like that." He paced for quiet. "Remember, Boone," the other ranch hand, stood nearby, cracking his knuckles, a cruel smile on his face. "Maybe he needs a lesson, Dutch. A reminder." I'm sorry, Dutch," Pike choked out, his eyes wide with a very real fear. "It was an accident." "We don't have accidents," Dutch hissed, tightening his grip. He was enjoying this, the assertion of his dominance. He was so focused on his victim that he never heard the whisper-soft footfall in the dust behind him. Alara moved like a wraith. The moonlight glinted off the long, polished steel of the branding iron she had taken from the smithy's dying coals. It wasn't red-hot, but it was heavy, solid, and perfectly balanced. She swung it in a short, brutal arc. The iron had connected with the back of Boone's skull with a sickening, wet thud. He dropped like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. Dutch spun around, his eyes widening in shock, but it was too late. Alara didn't hesitate. She reversed her grip on the iron and drove the handle forward like a spear, burying the pointed end deep into Dutch's soft belly. The air rushed out of him in a pained grunt. His grip on Pike loosened, and he staggered back, clutching his stomach, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. "The woman," he gasped, his mind refusing to process the reality of his attacker. "Jacob sends his regards, Dutch," Alara said, her voice as cold and hard as the iron she held. Pike, free and terrified, scrambled away into the darkness, his part in the drama finished. Dutch, however, was far from done. He was a brute, and pain only fueled his rage. With a roar, he lunged for her, ignoring the debilitating wound in his gut. Alara was ready. She dropped the heavy iron and sidestepped his clumsy charge, her movements fluid and practiced. As he stumbled past, she drew a long skinning knife from a sheath hidden in the small of her back. She didn't attack him from behind. She faced him. He turned, his own massive Bowie knife now in his hand. They circled each other in the moonlit dust, the distant music of the waltz an impossibly surreal soundtrack to their deadly dance. He lunged again, a wild, sweeping slash. Elara ducked under it, the blade whispering past her ear. She came up inside his guard, her smaller knife moving in a swift, precise thrust. It found the gap between his ribs, sinking deep. Dutch roared, a wounded bull's cry of fury and pain. He swung a backhand, catching her across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling. Her head hit the dirt hard, stars exploding behind her eyes. He loomed over her, his knife raised, a triumphant, bloody snarl on his face. "You'll die for that, you bitch." He brought the knife down. But Elara, dazed but not defeated, had pulled the Remington Derringer from her thigh holster. The two shots, fired from less than a foot away, were deafening in the relative quiet. They struck Dutch squarely in the chest, lifting the massive man off his feet and slamming him back against the corral fence. He hung there for a second, his eyes wide with the final, ultimate surprise, before sliding down to the ground in a lifeless heap. Elara lay there for a moment, her head spinning, the taste of blood in her mouth. She pushed herself up, her body screaming in protest. She retrieved her knife, cleaned it on Dutch's shirt, and without a second glance at the two bodies, she walked back toward the barn. She paused at a water trough, splashing the cold water on her face, rinsing the blood from her mouth, and tucking a stray strand of hair back into place. She composed herself, the deadly warrior melting away, the gracious hostess re-emerging. She re-entered the barn, a faint, almost imperceptible limp in her step, just as the fiddler was finishing his tune. No one had noticed she was gone. Meanwhile, in Jacob's office, Sheriff Brody had greedily poured himself a large tumbler of the special bourbon. The office was an oasis of quiet, the heavy oak door muting the party's noise. Framed pictures of Jacob and a smiling Elara lined the walls, silent witnesses. A very fine whiskey, Mrs. Vance, Brody slurred, savoring the taste. Your husband was a man of impeccable taste. He was a man who valued loyalty above all else, Sheriff, Elara said, her voice soft. She had not had a drink. She watched him, her eyes calm and patient. He thought of you as a friend. And I him, my dear, Brody said, his eyes beginning to droop slightly. The sedative was working faster than she'd anticipated. A tragic accident. A terrible, tragic. His voice trailed off. He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear it. Feeling a little sleepy. Just rest your eyes for a moment, Sheriff, Elara cooed. He slumped forward, his head hitting the polished oak desk with a soft thud. He was completely unconscious. Elara moved quickly. She took the sheriff's own handcuffs from his belt and secured his hands tightly behind his back. She retrieved the proof from Jacob's journal, a notarized document detailing a large payment from Thorne to Brody, and placed it on the desk in front of his face. Then, using a length of rope she had hidden behind the curtains, she gagged him tightly. She dragged the heavy, unconscious man to a small, hidden door behind a bookshelf, a door that led not outside, but down a short flight of stairs to a small, stone-walled root cellar. She rolled him down the stairs without ceremony and locked the heavy door from the outside, pocketing the key. Sheriff Brody was out of the game. He would wake up in a few hours with a splitting headache, a gag in his mouth, and damning evidence staring him in the face. His career, his freedom, it was all over. For him, a prison cell was a more fitting end than a quick death. Elara went back into the office, straight in the desk chair, and disposed of the bourbon bottle. She checked her appearance in a small mirror. A faint bruise was beginning to form on her cheek, but in the dim, flickering lantern light, it would be barely noticeable. 2 targets down. The most dangerous one remained. She took a deep breath, smoothed the crimson silk of her dress, and stepped back into the party, her serene smile perfectly in place. She found Marcus Thorne, holding his empty glass, a look of impatience on his face. There you are, my dear," he said. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten about me." "Never, Marcus," she replied, her voice a low, intimate murmur. "I believe you wanted a better view. Shall we?" She gestured toward the wooden staircase leading up to the hayloft. The final act was about to begin. The hayloft was an island of quiet suspension above the swirl of the party. From the large, Open loading doors at the back, one could see the vast, moon-drenched expanse of the Crimson River Valley. Marcus Thorne stood there, breathing in the cool night air, a self-satisfied smile on his face. Alara stood a few feet behind him, a silent shadow in the dim light. "You see, Alara," Thorne said, gesturing expansively at the land below. "This is a kingdom." Jacob was a good man, but he was a small man. He lacked vision. He was content with what he had. A man of vision sees what could be. "And what is it that you see, Marcus?" Alara asked, her voice dangerously neutral. "I see potential," he said, turning to face her, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "I see the Circle-T and the Crimson River, not as two ranches, but as one empire. Under the right leadership, of course. Your invitation to this dance. It tells me you understand. You're a practical woman. You know you cannot run this place alone. You need a partner, a protector." He took a step closer, his intentions clear. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the bloodless conquest. "The stampede was a tragedy," he continued, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "But the land endures. Jacob's legacy will be a part of something much, much greater. My legacy." Alara felt a cold, clean rage wash through her, burning away the last vestiges of fear. He was confessing, boasting of his crime, so certain of his victory he felt no need for pretense. "Was it a quick death, Marcus?" she asked, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear her. He froze, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What, Jacob? When Dutch engineered that stampede," she clarified, her voice losing its softness, hardening into steel. "Did he suffer?" The blood drained from Thorne's face. The mask of the charming suitor fell away, revealing the stunned, venomous snake beneath. He finally understood. This wasn't a surrender. It was an ambush. "You," he hissed, taking a step back, his hand instinctively going to the small pistol he wore in a concealed shoulder holster. "Nay," she confirmed. She didn't move for her own weapon. Her trap was already sprung. "You walked right into my house, onto my land, to dance on my husband's grave. Did you really think I would just let you take it all? You clever little bitch," he snarled, pulling the pistol free. "I should have had Dutch finish you off 6 months ago." He raised the gun to fire, but as he did, his boot, taking a backward step, landed on the section of the floor she had prepared. It wasn't a trapdoor, but something more subtle, a series of boards she and Ezra had painstakingly sawed almost all the way through from below and then covered with a thin layer of hay. Thorne's weight was just enough. With a sharp crack of splintering wood, the boards gave way. He cried out in shock as his leg plunged through the floor up to his hip, his pistol flying from his hand and skittering into a dark corner. He was caught, his leg trapped in the jagged teeth of the broken floorboards. Before he could even try to extricate himself, something dropped from the rafters above. The slip noose she had hidden, attached to the heavy block and tackle, fell perfectly over his head and shoulders, tightening around his chest and one arm. Thorne roared in rage and surprise, trying to claw the rope off, but Alara was already moving. She ran to the other end of the rope, the one tied off to a cleat on the wall. With a flick of her wrist, she undid the knot. The full weight of the block and tackle, combined with the rope's leverage, did the rest. Thorne was jerked violently upward. His trapped leg was wrenched from the broken floor with an audible snap of bone. He screamed, a raw, piercing sound of agony that was swallowed by a sudden, joyous crescendo from the fiddle below. He was hoisted a foot into the air, dangling helplessly, his arms pinned, his broken leg swinging grotesquely. Alara walked calmly to where his pistol had fallen and picked it up. She turned to face him. He was a pathetic sight, the powerful land baron reduced to a twitching pipata. "This is for the water rights you stole," she said, her voice even. She aimed carefully and shot him in his good leg. He screamed again, a desperate, gurgling sound. "This is for the cattle you rustled," she continued. She shot him in the shoulder. He was sobbing now, a blubbering, terrified mess. "Please, Alara, I'll give you anything. The land, money." She walked right up to him, the barrel of the gun inches from his face. His eyes were wide with the sheer, animal terror of impending death. "This," she whispered, "is for Jacob." She didn't shoot. She holstered the pistol. Killing him with a bullet was too quick, too merciful. She took out her skinning knife. The town will think you ran away, a coward who fled after your schemes were revealed, she said. The sheriff is in my cellar. Dutch and Boone are in my corral. Your empire died tonight, Marcus. She reached up and, with a single, practiced slice, cut the rope holding him. He dropped to the floor in a broken heap. Before he could even cry out, she was on him, the knife flashing once, twice, in the dim lantern light. It was a brutal, bloody, and silent end. She stood, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. She was spattered with his blood. She looked down at the architect of her husband's death, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than rage, a profound, soul-deep weariness. It was done. The last name was crossed off her list. She looked out the loading doors at the peaceful valley, Jacob's Valley, her valley. It was safe now. She had paid for its safety with her own soul. The music from the party below drifted up, a joyful, oblivious river of sound. The dance went on. The widow of the ranch stood alone in the silence of the hayloft, a queen victorious on a battlefield of her own making, surrounded by the ghosts of the men she had hunted. Alar's return to the party was an act of supreme control. She descended the wooden stairs from the hayloft, no longer a killer drenched in adrenaline, but once again the serene, gracious hostess. She had used a damp cloth from a water barrel to wipe the blood from her face and hands, and the shadows of the barn, coupled with the guests' whiskey-fueled haze, were the perfect accomplices. The crimson of her dress was a masterful camouflage, hiding any small stains that remained. She rejoined the swirl of the dance, her heart a cold, steady drum in her chest. The fiddler was playing a slow, melancholic waltz. The mayor, a portly man with kind eyes, saw the faint bruise on her cheek, now beginning to darken. "Mrs. Vance, are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You look pale." "Just a little tired, Mayor," she replied, forcing a weary smile. "It has been a long 6 months. But tonight has been a great comfort. Jacob would be proud," he said, patting her hand. "You've honored him well." The irony of his words was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had honored him, but in a way this gentleman could never comprehend. As the waltz played, she saw Pike, the reluctant accomplice, slip out the main door, his face ashen. Her deal with him was done. He would ride out of the territory tonight and never return, his life the price of his silence. She watched him go, another ghost vanishing from her life. The party began to wind down as the hour grew late. People, filled with food and drink, began to offer their thanks and make their way home, their heads full of the memory of a beautiful, poignant celebration. They would remember the lovely widow and her courage. They would have no idea they had been guests at a mass execution. When the last of the townspeople had gone, only the ranch hands remained, milling about, collecting plates and snuffing out some of the lanterns. They were leaderless. Dutch and Boone were missing, and no one knew where. Alara gathered them in the center of the barn. "Dutch and Boone have been called away on an urgent matter for Mr. Thorne," she announced, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that made them all stand a little straighter. "Sheriff Brody has also departed. It seems there is some trouble in Silver Creek that required their immediate attention." She let the lie settle. It was plausible enough to quell any immediate questions. "From this day forward," she continued, her gaze sweeping over their faces, "you answer to me. The Crimson River Ranch is not for sale. It is not finished. We will rebuild it, in Jacob's memory, to be stronger than ever. Anyone who is loyal to this ranch, to Jacob's legacy, has a place here. Anyone who is not, the road is that way." She stood before them, not as a grieving widow, but as the undisputed master of the ranch. The night's violence had forged a new woman, one of iron and resolve. The men, who had seen her as a temporary, fragile figurehead, now saw a leader. They saw the wife of Jacob Vance, and for the first time, they saw the same steel in her that they had respected in him. One by one, they nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The last act of the night was the most grim. After the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Alara went to Ezra the blacksmith, who had been waiting patiently in the shadows, her final, silent partner in the night's affair. Together, they performed the duties of undertakers. They wrapped the bodies of Dutch, Boone, and Thorne in heavy canvas tarps. They loaded them onto a wagon. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The work was grim, a final, bloody punctuation mark on a long and terrible sentence. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray. Alara, astride her horse, led a second pack mule into the town of Redemption. The town was just beginning to stir, there cool and smelling of wood smoke. She did not go to the sheriff's office. She went to the federal courthouse, to the office of Judge Isaac Blackwood, a man known throughout the territory for two things: his unyielding adherence to the law and his absolute incorruptibility. She found him in his office, already at work. He looked up, surprised to see the notorious widow of the Crimson River Ranch standing before him. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "To what do I owe the honor?" "I have come to report a crime, Judge," she said. "Multiple crimes." She placed Jacob's journal on his desk, open to the page detailing the bribes. She then handed him the key to her root cellar. "You will find Sheriff Brody locked in my cellar. He isn't harmed. He passed out from drink at my party last night. I took the liberty of securing him for you." She then told him a story. It was a masterpiece of half-truths and calculated omissions. She told him of Thorne's conspiracy with Brody and Hogan to steal her land. She told him of how she had discovered the plot in Jacob's journal. She told him that last night, Thorne and Hogan, in a panic, had tried to silence her. There had been a struggle. She had defended herself. "Thorne and his men are dead, Judge," she said, her voice steady. "I killed them." It was a bald confession, delivered without apology or fear. The judge was silent for a long time, his steepled fingers covering his mouth as he stared at her. He saw the bruise on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the utter lack of remorse. He read the pages of the journal. He knew of Thorne's reputation. He knew of Brody's corruption. "You took the law into your own hands, Mrs. Vance," he said finally, his voice grave. "The law was bought and paid for by the man who murdered my husband," she replied. "I did not have the law. I had a barn, a few guns, and a guest list. I used what I had." Judge Blackwood was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West. He knew that sometimes, in this land, justice did not come from a courtroom. It came from the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun. He looked at the woman before him, a woman who had orchestrated a symphony of vengeance with the skill of a master strategist, and he made a decision. "The official report," he said slowly, "will state that Sheriff Brody, in a drunken stupor, confessed his dealings with Thorne. It will state that when Thorne and his foreman, Hogan, were confronted, they resisted arrest and were killed in the ensuing gunfight. A federal marshal will be dispatched to your ranch to confirm the details and collect the bodies. Your name will not be mentioned." It was a pardon, delivered in the language of bureaucracy, a blind eye turned by the highest law in the territory. "You have brought a storm of justice to this valley, Mrs. Vance," the judge said, standing. "I suggest you go home and prepare for the peace that comes after." Alara simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. She turned and walked out, leaving the journal and the key on his desk. She had walked into the courthouse a killer. She walked out a free woman. The first light of dawn was not gentle. It was a stark, gray accuser, spilling over the mountains and illuminating the gruesome tableau in the wagon. Alara and Ezra worked in a grim, wordless rhythm born of necessity. The bodies were heavy, sacks of dead meat that had, only hours before, been the most powerful men in the valley. They transported their grim cargo to a remote, abandoned line shack deep in the ranch's western quarter, a place no one had reason to visit. Here, in the cold, hard ground, they were buried. There were no prayers, no markers, just the finality of the earth. Returning to the ranch house, Alara felt a hollowness that was different from grief. It was the vast, echoing emptiness that comes after a storm has passed, leaving the landscape scoured and unrecognizable. The adrenaline that had sustained her, the cold fire of rage that had been her constant companion for 6 months, was gone. In its place was a bone-deep weariness that seemed to settle in her very soul. She looked at her hands, raw from digging, and they seemed to belong to a stranger. The arrival of Federal Marshal Thompson and 2 deputies 3 days later was a quiet, tense affair. He was a tall, stern man with eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Judge Blackwood's official story, then rode out to the ranch. He walked through the barn, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He noted the freshly replaced planks in the hayloft, the faint, scrubbed stains near the corral fence. He didn't ask about them. He interviewed Alara in the main house, in the very room where she had once planned a life with Jacob. She met his piercing gaze without flinching, recounting the carefully constructed narrative of self-defense. She was a widow protecting her home from the men who had murdered her husband. It was the truth, in its own way. She had simply omitted the invitations, the music, and the waltz. It was a busy night, Mrs. Vance, Marshall Thompson said, his voice a dry rasp. 3 prominent men dead. The town sheriff found handcuffed and disgraced in your cellar. You seem to be the only common denominator. It was a long night, Marshall, she corrected him, her voice steady. The kind of night that comes after a long 6 months of injustice. He was silent for a long moment, studying her. He saw the bruise on her cheek. He saw the calluses on her hands. He saw the profound, unshakable exhaustion in her eyes. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who had spent 30 years in the West. He knew a thing or two about the kind of justice that didn't happen in a courtroom. My report will reflect the judge's findings, he said finally, standing to leave. It will state that this valley has been cleansed of a corrupt and violent element. The means were regrettable but effective. At the door, he paused and turned back. My advice to you, Mum, is to hang up your dancing shoes. A storm like the one you brought can't be called twice. With his departure, the final seal was placed on the events of that night. The story the world would know was one of crime and righteous, if brutal, retribution. The true story, the one of a meticulously planned massacre set to fiddle music, became a ghost, destined to be whispered but never proven. In the weeks that followed, Alara threw herself into the ranch with a ferocity that stunned her men. She was the first one up in the morning and the last one to bed. She rode the fence lines, her rifle holstered on her saddle, her eyes scanning the horizon. She negotiated cattle prices in town with a will of iron that made seasoned buyers sweat. She was no longer just filling Jacob's shoes, she was forging her own path, a path paved with his memory and tempered by her own brutal trial. The Crimson River Ranch began to heal, and so did its mistress. The laughter that slowly returned to the main house was not the carefree sound of before. It was deeper, more resilient. The silence had been broken, not just by a party, but by a declaration of survival. Alara found a new purpose, not in vengeance, but in creation. She was building again, not just a ranch, but a sanctuary, a testament to the men she had loved and the unyielding strength she had discovered within herself. The ghosts of the men she had killed still visited her in the quiet hours of the night, but their faces grew fainter, their accusations silenced by the thrum of a new, vibrant life taking root all around her. The valley was at peace, a peace she had purchased at an impossible price. A year passed, a year of hard work and quiet healing. The valley prospered under the new, honest sheriff, and the legend of the widow's dance became a cautionary tale that kept most trouble at a comfortable distance. But the West was a restless place, and peace was a fragile commodity. The trouble came from the north, a pack of human wolves led by a man named Silas Kane. He was not a schemer like Thorne, he was a plague. His gang of a dozen riders would descend on isolated ranches, taking what they wanted: livestock, money, lives, and burning what they couldn't carry. They were moving south, and the Crimson River Valley was directly in their path. Sheriff Miller, the new lawman, was a good and brave man, but he was a realist. His 2 deputies and a hastily formed posse of ranchers were no match for a dozen hardened, battle-tested killers. After Kane's gang annihilated the small Double G ranch, leaving the owner and his family dead, a wave of cold terror gripped the valley. That evening, Sheriff Miller rode to the Crimson River Ranch. He found Alara on the porch of the main house, cleaning Jacob's Winchester, the setting sun glinting off the polished barrel. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. "Ma'am," he began, his voice strained as he dismounted. "I reckon you've heard about the Double G." "I have," Alara said, not looking up from her work. Her hands moved with a calm, practiced efficiency. "We're gathering every man who can ride and shoot. We're going after them in the morning," he said. "It's a long shot, but we can't just let them ride over us. I came to ask, to see if you and your hands would join the posse." Alara stopped her work. She slowly raised her head, and her eyes, clear and cold as a mountain stream, met his. "A posse, Sheriff. You want to ride head-on into a dozen killers in a canyon of their choosing. You're not planning a fight. You're planning a funeral. The sheriff's face fell. We have to do something. Yes, she agreed. We do. She stood, leaning the rifle against the porch railing. My men are ranchers, not soldiers. They would be slaughtered. And I do not ride in posses. Then the valley is lost, he said, his voice heavy with defeat. Don't be so dramatic, Sheriff, Alara said, a faint, sharp edge to her voice. Running headfirst at a wolf is a fool's game. You don't hunt a wolf by chasing it. You hunt it by knowing the wolf, by setting a trap he cannot resist. She stepped closer, her demeanor changing. The rancher receded, and the strategist emerged. This Silas Kane, she began, her voice low and intense. What is he? A thinker, or a brute? A brute, Miller answered immediately. Vicious, arrogant, takes what he wants. Is he greedy? They say he'd kill his own mother for a gold eagle. Good, Alara said, a flicker of something cold and familiar in her eyes. Brutes are predictable. Greed is a leash you can pull. She turned and looked out at the valley, her valley. I will not have this peace broken. I will not have another family buried because of men like him. She turned back to the sheriff. Her face was set, her resolve absolute. You will not ride out in the morning. You will tell your posse to stand down. Instead, you will come back here, with a map of the territory and your 3 best men. Not hotheads, Sheriff. I need steady hands and men who can follow a complicated order without asking questions. You want to stop Silas Kane? Fine. I'll plan you a party he'll never forget. The sheriff stared at her, a mixture of awe and fear on his face. He was asking for help from a rancher, but he knew, in that moment, that he was taking orders from a general. The widow of the ranch, who had slumbered for a year, was awake. The trap was not a dance this time, but a Founder's Day festival. The bait was not a subtle social invitation, but the loud, brash promise of easy money. Flyers were posted in every town for 50 miles, a horse race with $1,000 prize, a high-stakes poker tournament, and a payroll wagon for the ranch hands. All to be held in the open field just outside the town of Redemption. It was an audacious, almost foolish display of prosperity, a fat lamb bleeding in a valley full of wolves. Silas Kane and his gang, hearing the news, laughed. It was too easy. Their plan was simple: let the town get drunk and distracted, then ride in, seize the race prize and the payroll, and burn the town to the ground as a final, bloody exclamation point. What Kane didn't know was that Alara Vance had planned every detail. The festival was her chessboard. The poker tournament was held in the back room of the saloon, a room with only one exit. The payroll wagon was a decoy, filled not with cash, but with 3 concealed deputies armed with shotguns. The race itself was the centerpiece of the trap. The final half-mile of the course ran through a narrow, dusty row, a perfect, natural ambush point. Alara did not participate. She directed the battle from a high church steeple, a spyglass in one hand, a system of colored flags in the other to signal Sheriff Miller and his hidden men. Kane's gang rode in, arrogant and swaggering. 3 of them, the card sharps, went straight for the poker game. Once they were inside, the door was barred from the outside by Miller's men. The outlaws were trapped. 4 others, including Kane himself, entered the horse race, eager for the glory and the prize. The rest of the gang spread out, drinking and waiting for the signal to attack. As the race began, Alara signaled the sheriff. The chili being served to the outlaws by the women of the town, chili made from Alara's own recipe, was laced with the same potent sedative she had used on Sheriff Brody. One by one, the waiting gang members grew drowsy and slumped over, to be quietly disarmed and tied up. The climax came at the race. As Kane and his men thundered into the final stretch, into the narrow royal, Alara raised a red flag. From the ridges on both sides, Sheriff Miller and a dozen armed ranchers rose as one. They didn't fire on the men, but at a series of dynamite charges Alara and Ezra had planted the night before. The explosions were immense, collapsing the walls of the arroyo at both ends. Kane and his men were caught, their horses screaming and rearing in the dust and chaos, the route ahead and behind completely blocked by a wall of rock and earth. They were trapped in a dusty tomb. "Drop your guns," Miller's voice boomed from the ridge. "It's over." Kane, enraged at being outsmarted, fired his pistol wildly at the figures on the ridge. That was his last mistake. A volley of rifle fire answered him, cutting him and his men down in a hail of righteous lead. From her perch in the church tower, Laura watched it all. She had not fired a single shot. Her weapon had been her mind, her ammunition the arrogance and greed of her enemies. She had turned a town festival into a perfectly executed military maneuver. She climbed down from the tower as the townsfolk were rounding up the last of the drugged, groggy outlaws. Sheriff Miller met her at the bottom, his face covered in dust, his eyes shining with a profound respect. "It's done, Mrs. Vance," he said. We did it." "No, Sheriff," Laura corrected him gently. "The valley did it. You just needed a better plan." She walked away, melting into the crowd, leaving the sheriff to his victory and the town to its celebration. Her work was done. From that day on, the legend of Laura Vance was sealed. She never again had to plan a battle. Her reputation did the fighting for her. Stories of the widow of the ranch and her deadly parties became a shield that protected the entire valley. Outlaws and would-be tyrants learned to ride a wide circle around the Crimson River territory. They knew that in that valley, the law was backed by something older and far more cunning. Laura lived out her days in peace, the formidable and respected matriarch of her domain. She was a builder, a leader, and a guardian. But sometimes, on a quiet evening, she would stand on her porch and look out at the vast, peaceful land. And she would remember the fury and the fire, the waltz and the blood. She knew, better than anyone, that the price of peace was eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the most effective weapon in the West was not a gun, but an invitation.